thanks for the invitation. And again, I welcome questions anytime. So I know that this audience is a technical audience, but if there is one thing that I would like you to get from my talk is that these AI ethics issues cannot be solved just with technical tools. So they need to be solved also by many other mechanisms where the technical tools are important, but also education, governance, policies, and so on. So I have divided my talk into parts. The first one is more general than IBM. The first one is a survey that we recently did and we published last week around what companies are doing actually around AI ethics, how they are going from principles to practice. And then I will tell you more specifically about IBM. So first of all, we are in the practice period of AI ethics. At the beginning, there was just some awareness of these issues. A lot of applications started to coming. So mostly in academia or in multidisciplinary environment, people started to think about what is this AI ethics, what is the impact of this technology. Then there were the principle period where everybody was writing and publishing principles, corporations, including IBM, but governments, academia, civil society, everybody. There are more than 100 sets of principles around AI ethics. After that, especially corporations, but also many other entities, understood that they needed to go from principles to something much more concrete. So you'll see a lot of standard work, a lot of regulations, a lot of internal policies, auditing, certification, and so on. And this is where we are right now in this phase of practice. So first of all, why AI ethics and not tech ethics in general? What is specific of AI that deserves a specific form of ethics or specific issues? And there are many reasons that are specific to AI. First of all, the need for some AI techniques to use a lot of data. So data privacy and governance issues are very important. The fact that some AI techniques are opaque in what regards how they get to the output starting from the input data. So the black box issue is an issue, especially if we want people to trust these systems. So nobody would trust probably a black box. And then the fairness issue. So since some AI techniques use a lot of data to learn how to solve problems, this data can hide inside some correlations between variables that are implementing or embedding in some sense some bias that then can result in an unfair behavior of the AI system. So the fairness issue. Robustness, to be able to, AI system sometimes do not handle very well exceptional circumstances, or accountability, who is responsible out of this use of statistic-based approaches if something doesn't go well. And then issues about human and moral agency and impact on jobs and society. So these are not all the AI ethics issues, but the most relevant ones that may convince you that really there is a specific AI ethics domain rather than tech ethics. So the next slide here is about why should a company care about AI ethics? After all, caring about AI ethics, it means spending more time, resources, time of people, making tools, and so on. And some companies may think that there will be regulation coming that implements some AI ethics principle. I will wait for a regulation and then I will comply to the regulation. But actually, this is a very insufficient and short-sighted approach. Companies should look at their own values, the trust of their customers, and what the clients ask about these issues. In general, social justice and equity issues, pressure from the media that is scrutinizing more and more what companies are doing with AI, And also they should see this also as a differentiator compared to other companies, because again, clients more and more ask what we are doing in general, what AI providers are doing in terms of AI ethics. So more business opportunities if company really take a good care of these AI ethics issues. So this study that I was mentioning that was published last week, it was a study that we did in a blind approach by interviewing more than 1,000 executives and AI developers in more than 22 countries to ask them what their company is doing around AI ethics to operationalize the principles. So the first one, the result was that about the perception. So how are companies perceived in addressing AI ethics issues? And here you see that tech companies are perceived at the highest level compared to more traditional companies. This is not surprising because in some sense, companies that are producing or delivering AI need to think more and need to do more about these AI ethics issues. The next one is what are companies actually saying of themselves? So their intention compared to what they are actually doing. And here you see that there is a gap. On the x-axis, you see a lot of different AI ethics issues, accountability, transparency, diversity, and so on. And then in blue, you see how many companies endorsed some principle around that topic, and whether they are operationalizing that principle. So you see that there is a big gap between endorsing a principle and operationalizing the principle. So there is still a lot of work to do. Many companies have incorporating AI ethics into existing business ethics mechanisms. This is the simplest thing that a company can do, no? Business conduct guidelines and so on. So it's a good thing that at least companies appear to include into business ethics some AI ethics training. This one is the most positive result that we got. So here you see the difference between two studies that we did. The last is the one in 2021 that was published now in 2022, and the one that was done 3 years ago. And the question here was, who is responsible in your company for this operationalization of the AI ethics principles? And in 2028, the blue part, they were mostly, technical leaders. Now in 2020, and very few non-technical leaders. You see the non-technical leaders on the left-hand side, technical leaders on the right-hand side. So the blue ones are very high on the right-hand side. So in 2028, companies thought that the responsible person is the chief technology officer, is a technical issue only. While in 2021, many companies have really transitioned to thinking that these are board level, CEO level issues. So they are company-wide issues. They're not just a topic for the technical part of the company. And I think this is a very good thing, because as I mentioned at the beginning, if there is one important thing to take out of this, is that these are socio-technical issues that need to be solved, not just with technical solutions, but also socio-technical. This is not a very good news, because still, in terms of diversity and inclusion, we have a lot of work to do. Women and the other groups are still very low in general in enterprise teams, the blue part, but even worse in the AI teams. That's the green part, you see. And why is that important? First of all, it's important because we want everybody to have opportunities within a company. But in the regard to AI ethics, is important because if we are not building diverse teams, then it's much more difficult to make an AI system, to build an AI system that does not have bias and can behave in a fair way. So there is still a lot of work to do in diversity and inclusion. The last thing from this study that I propose here is that what we saw, we asked companies, what do you think you will do between now and the next 3 years? And here we divided companies in the 4 quadrants, depending on how important is AI ethics for them, x-axis, how important is AI for them, the y-axis. And you see that the only quadrant that is growing in the next, predicted to be growing in the next 3 years, is the upper right quadrant. So companies that are expecting to have to be much more important to AI and also to AI ethics. So basically, this can be read in a very oversimplified way that more than 50% of the companies expect in the next 3 years to give a lot of importance to AI and also to AI ethics. So let's go now to the part about IBM. So at IBM, we started like everybody else with principles, very high level principles. And these are the 3 principles that we wrote for trust and transparency. We published them already in 2017. So we said, for us, the purpose of AI is to augment human intelligence and not to replace it. Data and insights from the data belongs to whoever created the data, and focus on transparency and explainability for AI and for every technology. And we call them the principles of trust and transparency. Then after the principle, we said, okay, but what does it mean to trust an AI model, an AI system? And we wrote these 5 pillars, which is where our AI ethics activities are structured. Explainability, so the ability of an AI system to explain why it got to a certain output, a certain recommendation or prediction. Fairness, so not discrimination in the behavior of an AI system. Robustness, transparency of how the system was built, what tests were done, what notion of fairness was used, and so on, as well as privacy, to prioritize, privacy and data rights. So from the principles, we went to these pillars to give more structure to all our activities around the 5 pillars. Then we said we need a company-wide governance to organize and supervise all these activities. And that's why we built this internal AI Ethics Board that has representatives from all the divisions of the companies and defines all the internal policies around AI ethics, educational material, risk assessment processes, evaluation of all our offerings, and besides being on top of all these activities, it's well positioned in the structure of the company, because upward it goes to the PAC advisor, the Privacy Advisory Committee, which has all the senior vice president of the companies, and downward it has a very direct connection to all the IBM business units with a network of focal points, people that are distributed over all the units that bring to the unit what the board has decided and bring from the unit to the board the grassroots initiative that are developed in the various units, as well as an advocacy network or people that help the board in the various work streams, but on specific projects only. Then this is what I was anticipating at the beginning. Of course, being a tech company, IBM has built tools, and in particular, one open source tools for each one of the 5 pillars. And you see some of them here, but we soon realized that the technical tools were not really everything that was needed. So we also put together educational modules for developers, but also for all other IBMers, playbooks for our AI developers to make sure that they integrate AI ethics solutions into the AI life cycle, not as an afterthought, but during the whole life cycle, just like they were used to integrate privacy by design or security by design. Now they need to integrate ethics by design as well. Adoption strategies to make it as easy as possible to do this integration of ethics by design. More new governance processes and roles within the AI lifecycle to make sure that there is an enforcing of this playbook. multi-stakeholder consultations, design thinking session to change the mind of these developers and to help them understand when there is a risk of bias or the explainability is not done well and so on, as well as an effort in the team diversity. So you see the tools are important. This is what the designers and developers use, but in the context of all these other initiatives. So altogether, it's a company-wide approach. We don't have an AI ethics team. We have an AI ethics board, but then it's the whole company that everybody in their own roles play a part in these AI ethics initiatives. So as I said, we started with the principles, then the pillars, then the guidelines, the toolkits, the pipeline revision, the offering evaluation, and then the governance on top, and then a lot of external partnership. You may have noticed that we have an internal AI ethics board. We don't have external advisors because we believe that the best way to cooperate with the outside, other stakeholders outside IBM is through our partnership. We have partnership with academia, with other companies, with the multi-stakeholder organization, with governments and so on. And this is our way of bringing our own experience and lessons learned and learning from the others. And the arrows that you see here in this picture, they tell you that this is not a static thing. It's a journey that we did in the last several years, and it will continue. For example, in this journey, we are already considering other technologies besides AI, like, for example, quantum computing, where IBM has a strong technical area, as well as neurotechnologies, where we also have a lot of researchers in that area. These are technologies that bring additional and possibly expanded AI ethics issues. So, for example, neurotechnology brings additional issues around mental privacy or human identity. And so usually we expect them to be combined with AI. So there is a way to learn what we have, to use what we have learned for AI ethics to accelerate the path also for neurotechnology applications. So overall, the lessons learned, so I'll summarize here. So first of all, we learned very soon that we needed to have a company-wide approach, not an AI ethics team. Isolated. A governance body with the power to make decisions for the whole company. So these are people that in the board that can go home in their own division and then implement the decision that is made by the board. A lot of multi-stakeholder partnership. We learned very soon that principles are just the first step. Then we need to fully operationalize them with technical and non-technical solutions, such as processes, education, guidelines, and so on. We also look a lot at regulations and we work with policymakers, but we don't wait for the regulation to come. We anticipate regulation internally, but also for our clients. And then also to make sure that we listen and work with all the stakeholders, clients, our partners, but also society and the media to define the concrete actions we do around AI ethics. So this is some links to our website on AI ethics, as well as the website that contains the whole study on AI ethics in action that I presented in the first part of the talk. So I'll stop here and then I'll wait for questions. I think we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. Thanks for your talk. And I have some questions. If you guys have questions, please prepare them. So in the beginning of your talk, you said about the data belongs to those who create the data. And let's say I'm using Google and Facebook, right, or TikTok, and I'm creator of that data, but the data belongs to those companies. So when you make this claim, what does it mean? What data are we talking about?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that companies using and building AI, they may have very different business models. No, the business models of IBM is of building AI to be delivered and used by other companies, like a government or a bank or an airport, right? So we give AI tools to these other companies to do better whatever they are doing. So we are not in the Google, Facebook, and other social platform business model. So we don't deliver, we don't use AI for our own services that are given to single individuals. This is the Facebook or social platform business model. So that's why when we say the data belongs to the creator, it means that if we deliver a solution for a hospital, for example, then we use to deliver that solution, we use the data that that hospital is providing us, but we don't reuse that data for improving the solution to some other for some other client. But we can do that, of course, because our business model is like that. We don't receive data from specific individuals. We receive data from another entity, another organization or a company, whether it's a hospital or a government or a bank, whatever. So that data that we use to make the best out of that solution, we don't reuse it for another solution for another client. But this, it makes sense if you understand again that there are these very different business models in using and delivering AI.
Yeah, okay, I understand. And also you said about the governance body, right? So there should be some like group of people who like decide whether or not it was AI was ethically implemented or not. This is
well, this internal AI Ethics Board, as I said, it has people, like around 20 people. They are representatives from all the business divisions of IBM, so research, marketing, communication, legal, products, government relations, all the divisions of IBM. And this body makes a lot of decisions. So first of all, it decides what processes developers should use, for example, to test and mitigate bias in an AI, in building an AI model. Or it decides whether an offering that we have for our system, for our clients, so suppose you want to deliver something to our client, whether it is aligned to our principles or not. Sometimes we say yes, sometimes we say no, sometimes we say yes, so you can deliver that to our client, but only if you put these constraints into the contractual agreement. So that board has the power to say, I'm sorry, you cannot deliver this unless you put these conditions. Or it puts together these technical tools that I mentioned to test and mitigate bias or to build explainabilities and so on. Or it also creates these educational modules for all IBMers, very high level, or for the developers, very much more in-depth. So this is a board set of people that are responsible for making this decision. And the most, you may say, the most difficult decisions are when you tell a team that wants to deliver something to a client, you tell them, well, you need to change something here, otherwise you cannot deliver it. But the board has the power of doing that. If the board says no, that product cannot be delivered.
Yeah, what I'm trying to understand is that, you know, let's just refer to like human nature, and when human has lots of power, they tend to abuse that power. And also, at least from my perspective, ethics is like very, it's you know, like the I don't know how to explain. Ethics is somewhat vague. I don't know if ethics could be like 100% objective, right? Like there are like, we can take any topic and we can like spend many hours discussing what is ethical and what is not ethical. But my point is there like some like mechanism to also control those people that are not abusing their power and that they
so tell me no, but first tell me what do you tell me an example of abusing the power.
No, I mean, someone can be like lobby their personal interests, right? And if that person has like decision-making sort of power, they can lobby what is according to their personal interest, not what is like beneficial for community or like for
yeah, but as I said, first of all, the decision is made by the board, not by one person, not even the chair. I co-chair.
Like, is there like a mechanism to reduce the level of sort of this like personal lobbying and like bring more objectiveness into this decision-making process?
Well, for example, in this risk assessment process that we put in place for assessing the solutions that we give to our clients and then deciding whether it can go out or not. We have a template, we have a very specific process. We have a template where we have specific questions that address all the 5 pillars and even more. So the team that wants to deliver that solution to the client has to fill that template in a way that is satisfactory. I mean, you cannot just not answer to some questions. And then the whole board meets and with the team to look at the way they fill this template, this form, and also to listen to their description of this solution. And of course, the team, in some sense, interest is to deliver the solution. The team will be also evaluated according to how many solutions they deliver, you know, so the team interest is in delivering the solution, and but the board interest is in making sure that the company does not deliver things that could be really result in negative impact on the company reputation, negative impact on the media, client trust that is damaged. So that is while a single team may think, oh, please let me, you know, I just want to deliver this thing that I worked on for long and so on. But the board, as far as I've seen since the board was started, has a much more global and long-term view. We say, okay, if we deliver that and we're not careful, then this is going to backlash because this is going to create discrimination, or this is going to damage the privacy of the people. And so, and, you know, we need to be consistent with the other things that we said, like, for example, that, you know, even our CEO in 2020 published a statement saying, we do not release general purpose facial recognition anymore. We do not condone mass surveillance with technology and so on. So we cannot then do something that is inconsistent with that, because immediately the media will pick it up, or immediately, you know. So even if there are people, so there are so many drivers that lead the board to make the right decision. Some people, because they say, oh no, this is about social justice. We cannot deliver this. This is going to create discrimination. But even if you don't look at social justice, then people will say, oh, this is going to not be good for a company reputation. So different divisions will consider a lot of different drivers. And overall, I've never seen the board as a whole making a decision that it can be not aligned to our principles. So again, the board reports to this other thing on top, which is the privacy advisory board, where there are the senior VPs of the company, and that's where the overall strategy is given. But again, there are so many people on the board with different drivers that drive their decisions, that overall, even if one person may want to deliver something that is risky, but overall the risk is always considered from many dimensions. One thing that we do for the board and the focal points and the advocacy network, so the whole governance people, is to evaluate to make sure that there is enough diversity. But not only at the board level, also including all these other people, because at the board level, the focus is to have the people that actually can make decisions for their business unit. So we want people there that when they go to back to their business units, they implement what the board has said. So we cannot just put anybody there. But overall, we have an evaluation of diversity.
Thanks. William, I see your questions. Do you want to ask them directly or you want me to read them?
I can summarize. Francesca, thank you for your talk on IBM AI ethics. With regard to the pillars that you listed out and the kinds of applications that IBM develops, including cognitive services and vision data mining and so on, can you please tell us more about some of the AI ethics in society and fairness, accountability, and transparency methods that implement these pillars? We're especially interested in the NLP and vision ones, and we also do work in my research group on RL for autonomous agents. I'm asking on behalf of our reading group on AI ethics in society, so that it's very interdisciplinary.
Okay, so so first of all, we have research and products around vision, but mostly we look at structured data and text, because that's where most of our clients are. So in our playbook that we put together for our AI developers, we help them understand for various forms of data. We help them understand, so we give them these tools. So the tools, for example, for fairness is called AI Fairness 360, is an open source tool, but we also have a proprietary version that we use internally. But that tool includes many different notions of fairness. And also you can use it with many different thresholds for bias, and with many different protected variables. So it can be race, it can be something else. No? So one of the most important things that we do in the playbook is to help these the developers understand when they need to, if bias is relevant, because as you know, they may have a list of protected variables, and they may see that their model does not have any of those, but it doesn't mean that bias cannot be included in the model. No, so they have to understand if there are things in their model that can be related to protected variables, and what is the right grouping, and what is of the protected variable values, and what is the so we spend a lot of time in helping our developers, whether it's natural language or images or structured data, how to understand whether bias is an issue in what they're building, okay? And in what form, what protected variables, what grouping, what definition of fairness should be the one that they consider, and what threshold for the bias is acceptable or not. And then once they understand that, then we give them this methodology and governance and tools to being able to test and mitigate bias in the various phases of the life cycle. For example, we have a proprietary tool called OpenScale that is specifically for structured data, where we have a lot of applications with structured data, or we have other ones for natural language data, where as a native data, or that you can treat not as a native kind of data, but first by defining the features for the text and then treating it as structured data. So we have a lot of different options and tools for our developers to, I'm just saying, detecting and mitigating bias. So the playbook, the tools, but also helping them understand, because sometimes, and we did with some pilots before we deployed the playbook to the whole company, sometimes teams were not used to this kind of reasoning. And so they were saying, oh, but I don't have race as one feature. And so there is no bias about race. But of course, they had like the zip codes, or they had other things that are proxies for those protected variables. But they were not used to that kind of, correlation.
Thank you very much.
Do you guys, when it comes to interpretability, and there are sort of lots of conversations about like black box around deep neural networks, and that's why, for example, in banking system, what I noticed that people using more predictable classical ML algorithm. Do you guys sort of prescribe to your clients what kind of algorithm they should use to solve their, for their applications, so it's much easier to drive this interpretability? Or maybe you are developing some tools to bring more clarity into like deep neural network architectures?
Well, okay. Well, as you said, there are many AI techniques that can be used. Some of them are more opaque, some of them are less opaque. They are more explainable, no, and traceable. So depending on whether explainability is a crucial element or not, we can decide to use different approaches to build a solution for our client. So we have, starting from the research labs, we have several approaches to build explanations for images, for different kinds of data, images, text, again, structured data, and so on. I think that, in general, I think that we work with our clients to that tell us what they care about. No, they tell us, is explainability important here or not? Of course, if you build something that goes to help a professional in another company to make decisions, usually explainability, some form of explainability is important, because otherwise this person is not going to follow something that doesn't even know how he got to a certain recommendation for a decision, for example. So we have various ways, and even OpenScale itself deals with bias, but also generates some forms of explanations. I think that at the very high level, I think it's fair to say that we work with our clients to understand what is the form and nature of explainability that they need for that application, and then we decide together what are the best techniques to use.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing also that, as I mentioned, is important to help these developers also to consult with clients, consult with whoever is going to use these systems, and not to have the same approach for every client for the same product. And that's not an easy thing, because you need to be able to talk with people that are not technical. Maybe you need to understand what they need to translate it into technical solutions.
Technical people, yeah. Also, I'm wondering, let's say there is a trained model, and that model is already deployed into production, right? And like over time, it faces with like real data, with real world, right? It can like deteriorate. It might there might be some changes that affect model and also affect on its like it sort of affects also on ethical side of things as well. Is there like mechanism to monitor if a model that works already in production, that it's follows those AI ethics principles?
Well, with some client, we not only deliver a solution, but we also offer a service to monitor over time. More generally, I think that we value a lot the transparency, the transparency aspect. So when we deliver something to our clients, we tell them, what, for example, data distribution they should be used on, and not a completely different one. So that means that we can, if we did some tests on a certain data distribution, and less tests on another data distribution is better to tell your clients, because we cannot guarantee the same accuracy or the same ethical behavior, bias, or whatever it is in another completely different data distribution. So, so that information, we try to give it to our clients so that even if they are on their own in the future, they need to understand where it is appropriate to use that solution or not. Because if you use it in a completely different place, then the behavior can be very different. But in general, we have products, we have solutions for our client, and we have the consulting division of IBM that can offer, our clients to monitor also after deployment what the model is doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Guys, do you have other questions?
Yes, I do.
Sure.
All right. So I'm Timothy from Xilinx. We are also a RegTech company working with financial institutions in the area of ethical AI. So very interested to pick a brain on this matter. Especially in the development of the product side of things, I think one of the main difficulty is trying to contextualize the fairness principles or the ethical principles to the different locations and different regulations around the world. How do you go about creating that kind of transparency in terms of your products, and how that might affect various kinds of people around the world?
Yeah, so IBM, of course, has deployed solutions all over the world. So in very different regions with very different cultures and very different ideas about ethics, right? So, but we decided, and very different legal systems, various regions of the world. So that's why we decided to not wait for the regulations, which can be very different and requiring very different things in different regions of the world, but to decide on our own in a centralized way what it means to be compliant to our principles. So every developers team needs to follow our ethics by design playbook, whether it's in the US, in Europe, in China, in Australia, whatever. So it's of course there are some flexibilities in the playbook, but overall the approach is the same. And when we evaluate the offerings to our clients, the board evaluates the offering. We don't change our evaluation, whether the offering is going to be deployed in Japan or in China or in the US or in Europe. The evaluation and the criteria for evaluation is the same. Sometimes, yes, we find some culture clash, because sometimes people from certain region of the world, they're not used to thinking around bias as much as we think maybe in the US or in Europe. But overall, the template is the same to be filled by these offering teams, and the criteria are the same, and the people on the board are the same. And so and in fact, there is some contextualization, but the contextualization is because the board, when it considers an offering, when it evaluates the risk of an offering, evaluates the properties of the technology, and that's independent of the region of the world, the client, the uses that this technology, that the client is going to do for this technology, and this again is independent of where, but also the client and the context itself. So whether the client has a good history of respecting human rights and freedoms and so on or not. So for example, I remember in the past, we decided to not release a technology, even though the technology was perfectly fine and the uses were perfectly fine, but we did not like the context in which we were asked to deliver it. So, but to answer, your question is, we use the same criteria, same approach for all the regions of the world, independently also whether there is a regulation or not.
Right. And just to follow up on that, I guess it seems that you're doing a lot within IBM, but how can like end users also know what kinds of checks have been done? So for example, you mentioned that applying like similar principles and criteria, and maybe in the case of the US, you screen your models and ensure fairness for across whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. But if you're going to apply that similar type of screening to contacts in Asia, everyone will be just classified as Asians, and that kind of screening mechanisms will not have any meaning or value in that particular.
No, of course,
process.
in every solution, the protected variables and the grouping of the protected variables may be different because of the different deployment scenario. So the playbook does not say which are exactly the protected variables and the grouping you have to use. You contextualize in the scenario. But when we evaluate the deployment of these solutions, the criteria are the same. So what was the second question, sorry?
Yes, so how can consumers basically get access to information about how these models are being like audited?
Internally, yes. Well, we try to be transparent with our clients, but our clients are not the final consumers, no? So we deploy something to a bank, and then the bank uses that to deploy a service to the individuals, for example, right? So so we try to be transparent with our clients, and sometimes in some of the offerings we mandate that the client is transparent with the customers. But I'm trying to remember, you know, this transparency is mostly on, for example, on the data collection, on the possibility of opting out, or the fact that some even object recognition is used, you know, it has to be very transparent. So we mandate some things that the client needs to do in deploying that service. Like, so I think that we tackle this that you say with transparency with our clients, and then sometimes mandating in the contractual agreement with the client that the client does certain things to make it transparent. But transparency, not really about the auditing process, but about what these customers are subjected to. So whether they can opt out or opt in, whether they are subjected to some object recognition or some textual analysis or whatever. So transparency of that kind, we mandate often with the client.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Maybe one more question, if I might sneak it in. If you could share a bit more in terms of like operationalizing this whole process, because for example, a lot of the historical data that you collected might be already biased, and so using it for downstream model training would then have results in like a biased model. So how do you set up the entire process to make sure that data coming in all the way to the final model produced meets the accepted level of
well, we have this bias testing and bias testing, no? Over the model and over the training data and so on. So even if the independently of when the data was collected, if you apply the bias testing now with the correct notion of fairness and protected variables, you will see whether it's biased or not. But there are some products that were trained with the models that were trained with the very old training data, and we couldn't have access to the original training data. We just had the model. So in some cases, I remember that in some cases we decided to sunset, to stop that model to be deployed, because we could not have access to what we needed in order to detect whether there was bias or not. So if we cannot figure out whether it's biased or not, then we decided to remove that model from the offerings.
And would the playbook that you are mentioning be publicly available?
Well, the playbook is an internal thing, but we are planning to make it a more maybe concise and abstracted and less detailed version available externally. Yes.
All right, thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, if once it's available, we would appreciate if you could let us know, and we will share with our community. It would be like really great. Guys, do you have other questions? I have question. Probably it will be last question. Do you guys work with government on, on lawmaking process? Because I assume that AI ethics is also something that can be mandatory for certain companies, right? Do you also sort of work closely with government on that part?
Yeah, so for example, in Europe, now there is this proposal for a regulation around AI. It's called the European AI Act, that is under discussion and will be then be discussed by the European Parliament. And in, I don't know, 1, 2, or 3 years, it will be, when approved, it will be in effect in all over Europe. And as a first step, the European Commission, in order to understand these AI ethics issues, put together they called it the high-level expert group on AI that really defined the AI ethics guidelines for Europe. And for example, I was a member of that. There were 52 members. Very multi-stakeholders, so there were consumer rights associations, lawyers, philosophers, psychologists, business people, researchers, and so on. And that was given really the definition of what we call the trustworthy AI with certain requirements. And if you look at this regulation proposal that the European Commission published recently, last year, this document defining trustworthy AI is the basis for that. So that is one way, for example, that we work with the policymakers. Other ways, of course, is to communicate with them and to help them, for example, to give feedback on this or other regulation proposal. For example, one thing that we didn't like of an initial draft of the regulation proposal in Europe is that it was defining as high or low risk entire sectors like healthcare, high risk, or HR, or whatever. So it was a very broad way of defining what is high risk or low risk. And we were very strongly saying, no, that this is not the right way. You need to be more fine-grained. And then depending on the risk, you need to define more or less obligations. And now in the draft, in the proposal that is being published, instead there are more fine-grained. So we, of course, we don't push regulators, but we tell them our opinion about what we think it makes sense. Another thing is we participate in many discussions with the policymakers around the impact of the regulation, or around some vagueness in the regulation that we think needs to be resolved, or for example, in that regulation there is also a definition of AI system, whether that definition makes sense or not. So various things that where we communicate with policymakers. We also work with governments in multi-stakeholder organizations. For example, there is a new recent initiative called the Global Partnership on AI, which is a set of various countries, governments, I think about 20 or 25, that got together to understand how to collaborate around AI ethics, responsible AI, and so on. And so, there are several, in this organization, there are several working groups of experts nominated by the various governments that work together in various projects. So that I'm also part of one of these working groups. So that's also another way to collaborate with governments at the global level to help them understand the risks, the priorities, and so on. So there are various ways to work with the policymakers.
Thanks for sharing, and thanks for your time, Francesca. Yeah, it was great learning about what you guys are doing at IBM.